just to start off, the handout for this talk is this one with the tomatoes on the front of it. You should all have a copy. And so I'm Rebecca Brown. I am a professor at University of Rhode Island, where I lead the vegetable program. And back in 2019, my colleague Andy Radin and Suresh and I formed a collaboration with some of our soil science colleagues, including Joseph Flores, who's going to speak after me, assuming he gets here. He's currently stuck in traffic. To look at nutrient mineralization and cycling in high tunnels. And the impetus for this study was a previous study that Andy had done along with a bunch of other extension people throughout New England, where they were trying to correlate soil nutrient status and tomato yield for high tunnel tomato production systems. And they went into that assuming quite naturally that the systems with a higher soil fertility would have higher yield and that the systems with lower fertility would have lower yield. But what they found was that there was no correlation at all. And they had these tomato high tunnels with so much organic matter that it might as well have been soil as potting media that they were growing in, and nutrients out the wazoo, and there were others that had very low nutrients, and yields were just all over the place. So we started this study to try to figure out, what's going on in the soil with nutrients. Joseph is hopefully going to be able to explain to you what's going on in the soil with nutrients. But Suresh asked me to talk about nutrient management in tomatoes. And I started thinking about it and decided that since I can't really tell you how much nitrogen to put on your tomatoes to get maximum yield, that I would look more at the persistent and increasing problem of yellow shoulder, blotchy ripening, gray wall, there are a bunch of different terms for it. It's all the same syndrome. And what it is basically a situation where the developing tomato fruit gets inadequate potassium. And as a result, some of the cells in the fruit don't form properly and then don't ripen. Okay? And that obviously leads to a tomato that is either unmarketable or marketable only as a second. So we know that the primary cause of this problem is potassium deficiency in early fruit set. But figuring out why we have a potassium deficiency is tricky. In some cases it's out and out potassium deficiency, but in a lot of cases it's not. Your soil test report will come back that you've got plenty of potassium. The problem is that the potassium is not getting where it needs to. One thing that can cause that is if your soil is too high in other cations, other positively charged ions, particularly sodium, magnesium, or calcium, because all of these compete with potassium, both for binding spots in the soil and for uptake into the roots. So if you've got your balance way off, your plant may not be able to take up the potassium that's there. If you have low cation exchange capacity, which here in southern New England usually means you have low organic matter, the potassium in your soil may not stay in the root zone if you have a lot of water, whether because you're irrigating heavily or in field production because we have a wet year. Because potassium does leach. Another problem is excess nitrogen. And in tomatoes, during fruiting, you need to have 2 to 3 times as much potassium as you do nitrogen. But if you've got a bunch of organic matter in your soil, and your soil is warm, that organic matter is breaking down, it's mineralizing into nitrogen. Then, if you're fertigating with fish emulsion, which is often very low potassium, you're adding nitrogen, you're not adding potassium. You get yourself into a situation where you may have your ratios reversed. And you've got lots of nitrogen going on and nowhere near enough potassium for the amount of nitrogen you have. And then the final thing, of course, is insufficient transpiration. Everybody knows what transpiration is? Yeah? Movement of water through the plant, from the roots to the leaves, driven by evaporation. So transpiration requires several things. Obviously, you got to have water in the soil. You have to have functional roots. If the roots aren't working, they're not taking up the water, you aren't going to have transpiration. You have to have healthy, functional leaves. The leaves have to have their stomates open. And if conditions are such that the leaves don't have their stomates, which are their water and air pores, open, you don't get any transpiration. And then transpiration is driven by evaporation. Evaporation, of course, is driven by a gradient of water content between where the water is and where it's going. So if your relative humidity is 98, 99% in the canopy, you're not going to have any transpiration because you don't have a gradient. The water's not going to leave the plant because the air's full. So all of these things can cause lack of transpiration. One issue that's seen with tomatoes is overly warm soil, and I was very happy to see white weed barrier in there rather than black. You know, if you're using black plastic mulch, black weed barrier, particularly in a high tunnel, you really need to watch your soil temperature. Because if that soil temperature goes above 85 in the root zone, those roots are going to stop functioning properly because they're heat stressed. So you need to keep, either by using white plastic or by watering with colder water to bring down the soil temperature. You need to keep your soil temperature below 85 if you want your plant to be taking up nutrients. Okay. Also, if it gets above 90 in the canopy, the plant's going to stop transpiring properly. Okay, at that point, the plant gets heat stressed. It's like, I can't cope with this. And it basically metabolically shuts down until the weather cools off. And the thing to remember there, of course, if you've got a high tunnel, you've got your tomatoes trellised up to the roof, it's going to be a lot hotter up at the top than it is down low because heat rises. And that's particularly true if you don't have ridge vents, don't have end vents. So all of your ventilation is happening lower down. You get this pocket of heat up in the top, and that can really stress out your plants too. So all of those are things to watch out for with tomatoes. So if you look in your handout, I gave you some pictures, including one that's a cartoon that shows you how potassium works in the soil system. So potassium is positively charged, but it's only got one positive charge, and it's a fairly large ion. This is all relative, right? I mean, ions are tiny, but compared to other ions, it's pretty big. And so what that means is that potassium can't stick very tightly in the soil. And it is easily knocked off into solution. Now, on one hand, this is good because it has to be in solution for the plant to take it up. But on the other hand, this is bad because when it's in solution, if the plant doesn't take it up, the potassium will just flow wherever the water goes. And so that's why potassium can be leached out of your soil, particularly if you have a low cation exchange capacity. And you can wind up with a lot more magnesium and calcium than you have potassium. The other thing is that potassium is primarily taken up passively through channels. And what this means is that you've got to have a gradient within the plant. So again, you have to have transpiration going on, or basically the roots will fill up with potassium and no more will be taken up until that backlog gets cleared out. Okay, and so even if you have potassium in your soil, you can have low potassium in your tissue and in your developing fruit. On the next page, if you look, there's actually a micrograph that shows what happens to the cells when you don't have enough potassium. So these are cells in a ripe tomato fruit. Image A at the top is where we've got the yellow shoulder and blotchy ripening. And you see how small and collapsed looking those cells look? Compare them to image B. That's the section of that same tomato that ripened properly. That's what those cells are supposed to look like. But because they didn't get enough potassium, they didn't form properly, they didn't grow properly, so they're small and misshapen, and they're never going to ripen properly either. Instead of the chloroplasts in the green tissue turning into chromoplasts and filling up with lycopene, assuming it's a red tomato, those chloroplasts are just going to die. And so instead of going from green to red, your tissue goes from green to white. And, you know, that's where you wind up with all of those problems. So what can you do about it? Well, one thing to do about it is choose varieties with better heat tolerance. Now, heat tolerance has only really been looked at in determinate red slicing tomatoes and processing tomatoes. Nobody's really looked at it in the heirlooms. But I gave you a summary from a 2019 trial that was done by Gordon Johnson and Emily Ernest at University of Delaware. It was a field trial, but it would be applicable for us to high tunnels because their open field situation is a lot hotter than our open field situation because they're further south. And what they found was that the varieties Jamestown Primo Red and Red Bounty did very well. They had very low incidence of white tissue. But Mountain Plus, Mountain Fresh, and Mountain Merit and Camaro all had really high values. Red Deuce was sort of in the middle. So if you're going to grow those kinds of tomatoes, you may want to try and steer towards the varieties that are more tolerant of heat, less prone to white tissue. With heirloom tomatoes, the one thing we know is that the varieties that have dark green shoulders when the tomato is unripe tend to also have problems with yellow shoulder and bad ripening. And dark green shoulder is a genetic trait, so it's characteristic of the variety. So it's one that you can try to avoid by selecting varieties that don't have that trait. Another thing is it may well be worth your time at first flowering to send leaf tissue samples in to the UConn lab and get them tested so that you know what your potassium, magnesium, calcium, and nitrogen levels are. Because that way, if your potassium is not high enough, and it should be at least 3% by weight, you know that you need to get some more potassium on quickly so that the developing fruit have enough. because once the fruit have developed, it's too late to stop the potassium deficiency. Those cells have already become malformed and improperly functioning. We already talked some about controlling temperatures, but basically you want to do everything you can to keep transpiration functioning and keep your roots cool enough. And then you want to adjust your fertility program. Make sure that you're getting enough potassium down, even if you have to spray it on the foliage, and be sure that your magnesium to calcium ratios are right. Again, even if you have to spray it on the foliage. So that's basically what I've got. Any questions about that?
So if you're spraying onto foliage with potassium, but
Yes.
you're also having a transpiration issue, wouldn't that cause a problem to begin with for receiving the potassium into the plant?
No, because when you spray it onto the foliage, it can actually be absorbed through the epidermis and into the tissue.
Even if the cell walls are shut off for transpiration.
Well, because it's not the cell walls that are shut off, it's the stomates.
Yeah.
And it gets absorbed directly through the tissue, not through the stomates. All things being equal, plants are much better at taking nutrients up through their roots than they are through their leaves. But if the roots aren't doing the job, then you got to go to the next best option, which is putting it on the roots. And the nice thing about spraying potassium is that potassium bicarbonate is millstop. It controls powdery mildew, so you get double benefit from your application. Other questions? Okay, and
I have a
Yeah.
comment. Like one thing I've seen in terms of heat issues is when people put the compost that's not completely finished, and then it goes in the high tunnel, it like heats everything up.
yeah, so when the compost isn't completely finished, that can heat the soil definitely, but I think the bigger issue there is going to be ammonia. And that can be really dangerous, especially if you're doing it in April and you've still got your high tunnel buttoned up because it's cold out. That ammonia can build up in there. That can actually kill plants if it's too much. Yeah.
Yeah, about unfinished compost. I mean, compost can be really useful for suppressing disease as well, but only when it's really mature. And so if you if you think you get that benefit from your compost and the compost is not finished, then think again, not getting that benefit.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you made it, Joseph.
Oh, this is not Vermont, I tell you that. There's barely any traffic in Vermont. But down here it's like New York City without the honking. At least people are friendly about it, right? So.
All right.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Sure.
And now we have our next speaker, soil scientist. And I will let him introduce himself at the same time. Yep.
I'm going to take one of them.
Yep.
So I know which page we're on. And then this is later.
Yeah, and then if you can stand over there, I don't need to move the camera.
All right. I think I'm in the right spot, right, for the camera, more or less.
Oh,
Yeah.
let me give you the microphone too.
Oh, yeah,
You can
yeah.
record it.
Microphone, yeah.
There you go.
Get recorded.
Yes.
Might be on TV or something. I don't know. Kind of cool. All right. My name is Joseph. Joseph Gurris. I work at UVM, and usually I give talks about earthworms, but that's what I'm going to do on Saturday in Pennsylvania somewhere. I don't know, Scranton or someplace like that. But today I'm here in a different role. I'm involved with a project that Rebecca has started about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago.
2019.
2019,
Yeah.
before the world went to pot, right? So we're getting to happier times now. But anyway, so she started a project on how to manage tomatoes in high tunnel. And so one part of the project is, well, actually there's a few parts of the project that have to do with nutrient cycling, and some other parts have to do with what's happening to your water when you're irrigating in a high tunnel. And my role in that project is as a modeler. So I basically look at information from the high tunnels that are participating. I look at moisture data that comes from the high tunnels. I also look at some of the nutrient cycling, or some of the nutrient, shouldn't say nutrient cycling, not yet, but the nutrients that nutrients that are in your soil. Either those nutrients were collected by just simple soil samples. So you go in, you take a soil sample, you send it off somewhere, and it comes back. You get the typical soil test that you probably all do already. Get that back, and so it's information about everything but nitrogen. And then there's another collecting device in the high tunnels that are collaborating. And I think this is one of the high tunnels. And those things are called resin caps, or resin capsules. They're basically just small balls of resin, and there's two kinds. There's the resin that can collect cations, and there's resin that collects anions. Rebecca's already talked about cation exchange capacity. So the attraction of, or the storage of cations on negatively charged particles in the soil. So these resin caps are very similar to that. So but there's, as I said, there's two of them, two kinds. The ones that mimic cation exchange, and then there's others that mimic anion exchange. So we don't, in our soils, we don't really have much anion exchange. You go to the tropics, there's a lot more anion exchange going on than up here. I look at that kind of information, and as I said, I also look at moisture variations in the soil. And as I said, I'm a modeler, and why do we use models to kind of try to get to the truth in high tunnels? Well, models can give you data that you cannot easily collect. For example, moisture data. You can get moisture data, but you don't really know how much water is actually moving through that soil. You know how much. You might figure out how much infiltrates, but how much is coming out of the other end? Out of the root zone. How much water is transpired by the plants? How much is evaporated away from the soil? All those things are really difficult to measure. In fact, the USDA Agricultural Research Service had these really interesting and cool installations called weighing lysimeters. So they had these soil cores that were sitting on a scale. So there's a couple of tons of soil material that was sitting on basically a scale. And so then what they wanted to measure was how much rainwater is actually infiltrating. That would basically lead to an increase in the weight of that soil monolith. And then they wanted to know how much is coming out. So they had collectors below where they can collect the leachate or the percolate. They could analyze that, of course, for chemistry, but really they were interested in, what is the relationship between that rainwater comes in, the percolate that comes out the bottom, and the soil and the plant. Unfortunately, those things have been closed down, so there's no more research going on at the USDA with this kind of installation. They will probably nowadays cost several $1 million, and probably $1 million to run. So it's really difficult to install those to support this kind of research in high tunnels. So instead, we use models that will predict what happens to the rainwater, or in your case, the irrigation water. So that's one really good reason why we use models, because we can't. It's not cost effective. Nobody is going to spend $1 million for that kind of installation in a greenhouse. I mean, I could take a poll. How many of you would pay $1 million to know what happens to your water? Nobody. Oh, such a shame. I would love to have one of those things. But anyway, so my job is to figure out what happens to the water, and then also what happens to the nutrients that you apply, or the nutrients that are already in the soil. If you have, already have some, nutrient credits from the previous year. And I heard that some of you are using compost. How many of you are using compost in your? So that's usually a really slow process in terms of the mineralization, and you probably have to think way ahead of time. So that actually makes my job a lot harder, because now I not only have to think about nitrate, nice, it kind of just percolates through the soil, it's great. Now I have to think about what's happening to this compost. How does it break down, and the like. So the model that I'm trying to bend into shape to work with this, so no model really does high tunnels. It's called hydrous. So by that name, you can probably guess that one of the major components of hydrous is a soil water component. So it predicts how much water infiltrates, how much water is evaporated and transpired by the plants, and how much water is leaching out of the soil, and how much water is available to the plants at any time during simulation time. And you have your handout. There's a whole bunch of things in the handout that may be interesting, maybe not, but what I like to draw your attention to is the third page is the first page of the model data. And on that page we have a scenario that goes with a greenhouse that is high tunnel, a high tunnel that adds something like 0.2 to 0.3 inches every day. And what you see there are 5 graphs. The first graph in the top left-hand corner shows you how much infiltration you have through the season. So what this tells me, I looked at how much water is actually applied during that period of time, and all the water that's applied at that rate is infiltrating into the soil. So we're looking at something like 100 centimeters of water. So that's that's 40 inches of water. That period of time. And then I checked out the next graph over. So top right-hand corner, I checked out how much water is actually taken up by the roots. So what is supporting transpiration and growth, and that's about 50% of what was applied. So what else is happening? So the model is telling me that there's also 25% that is evaporated from the soil, where the soil is open, and it also tells me that there's about 15% of that water that is percolating out of the root zone. And so that is somewhere where you say, well, water is perking out the root zone. That's actually not all that great, right? Because that water is taking some of the nutrients that you've applied and that you've paid for out of that root zone. And you're probably all aware of that, because you look at the bottom line, how much fertilizer you have to buy, how much compost you have to buy. And it costs you money, right? And irrigation itself costs you money as well. So you don't really want to throw this away, throw that water away. If you look at the very bottom of the graph, the bottom right-hand corner, it shows you what's happening with the soil moisture. So you may notice that at the beginning it's pretty steady. The plants are not growing really fast in early May, and then soil water is being drawn down, and it's not sufficient. There's not sufficient irrigation going on at this point to prevent some of the soil layers. There's 4 soil layers that I'm looking at here. Some of the soil layers to go to the permanent wilting point, which we all know that's when death is permanent. The wilt is permanent. Plants are not coming back. So that's one of the scenarios. Another scenario is on the next page. In this case, the farmer is adding half an inch of water every day. And right away, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, so where we were just a few seconds ago, you notice that the level of moisture is pretty constant, and it's above field capacity. So that means, do you know what that means? Water level is above field capacity.
It's just treated.
It's just whatever is above field capacity is just leaching out the bottom of the root zone. So that's water thrown away, and that's probably nutrients thrown away as well. In addition to that, if you look at the actual root water uptake, it's very small. It's only 14 centimeters, so that's only 10 inches. So much less than in the previous case. So we had like 20 inches of uptake by the roots. So how come the roots are not taking up all this stuff? So basically, plant uptake is really weird. So when the soil is close to saturation, then the plant is not taking up water, and then when you get, or it's taking up water maybe, but at a much slower rate. And then if you go to the permanent wilting point, get close to the permanent wilting point, the plant also slows down. And what does that mean in reality? It basically means whenever transpiration slows down, growth slows down. This is less photosynthesis going on. So over irrigating, so more is not better, as I tell my students all the time. They always want to pour the water on. No, don't do that. The next scenario is actually one where the farmer is applying water intermittently. Basically makes a decision, what does the plant look like, is the plant wilting or not, and then applies the water. And so the water applications here are between 0.1 of an inch and 0.7 of an inch. And as I said, it might be every other day. Sometimes there's 6 or 7 days between the application. If you look at the middle graph in the first column, it says soil water storage. It's basically soil water, and if you look at that graph, the soil water is decreasing. You notice there's little bumps in there. That's the irrigation events. But essentially, even looking at the plant and saying, oh yeah, the plants now need water, it didn't really help. So moisture is plummeting through the season, and in fact towards harvest or towards the end of the season, the soil actually is close to reaching the permanent wilting point. And you don't really want to get close to the permanent wilting point because the plants are slowing down way ahead of the permanent wilting point, transpiring and picking up water. If you go to the first page again, the blabbing blurb, it shows you how this works. So this is essentially how a model looks at transpiration and root water uptake. And it's modeled after, of course, data that was actually collected. What you see there's this thing called the Rwu Reduction Factor. And so that's, you have to multiply whatever you think evapotranspiration should be based on solar radiation or the energy that is coming in. This tells you different points of moisture where the plant is starting to react differently to the energy. I love bananas too. Still one later. So the first point is, 0 means the soil is totally saturated. So the the leftmost point here is the soil is saturated and the multiplication factor is 0. Right? So you go along there, and from that point to the next known point, which is called H1, whatever you want to call that, there's no transpiration. The soil is too wet. And then, as you hit H1, suddenly the plant starts to transpire, but slowly at first, and then as the soil dries a little bit more, it goes up and up and up, more transpiration, and then there's this area that's really flat, and the transpiration factor is 1. That's your best moisture content for transpiration. And then eventually you get to another point where the transpiration, so when you get a lot drier, transpiration once again slows down, and then at the permanent wilting point it becomes 0 again. So that's how that works. So if you look at that second data sheet, where the water content is above field capacity all the time, that's why that plant is not transpiring and not growing as much as maybe in the first and the third scenario. So beware of overwatering, beware of underwatering. You just have to get it just right. It's really cool, right? So that's what you want. So something else I wanted to say about models, or about this modeling effort. This modeling effort is really in support of another modeling effort, which is essentially an app that you can hopefully at some point download onto your smartphone, so you can make your phone even smarter than you are already, or than it is already, and it will basically help you predict what happens if you change management, whether it is increasing the irrigation, or whether it's putting more compost on, or more inorganic nutrients. What will happen to the nutrients? What will happen to that water? How much is it going to cost you? So that's where we're going to go with this. And there's actually 2 really cool apps that are already out there that have nothing to do with this project, but that I love, because I can tell my students. So I have to tell students stuff. So I have to come up with something. So there's one app that's called the UC Davis Soil Web app. Anybody knows that already? It's essentially the soil survey on steroids. It's got a really, really cool interface, much better than the soil web survey. You can walk around this with your smartphone, and if you have a location on, most of the time it tells you what soil you're on. And so you kind of and the details on where to download it if you wanted it is in the handout. So that's one of them, and I really like that because I can tell my students, hey, take a walk in the park and find out what kind of salts there are, and then dig a hole and see whether it's actually true what they're telling you, which is really interesting because many times it's true, but sometimes they're way off. So that's something to learn for students that go into agriculture. You can't always rely on things. Sometimes it's great, and sometimes you miss it quite a bit. The other one that I love is a Cornell app that's under climatesmartfarming.org, and it's an irrigation management tool, and it's really neat. That's the graph down here, and it basically grabs data from the nearest weather station. So you put your location on, and it finds the nearest weather station, and then it downloads that data and calculates out what the water deficit is given your soil type. So you can choose different soil types, and you can choose one of, I think, 16 different crops that you can grow, and it'll tell you where you are. So this graph here shows you in the beginning. This was March 2022. So little transpiration. The water content of the soil is predicted to be really close to field capacity. Nothing is taking it out. Snow melt is there. Whatever else is happening, it's replenishing the water that might be draining out, and so you're staying at field capacity until you start your crop, and at that point the moisture is dropping really quickly, and if you don't irrigate, then you end up at the perm wilting point, of course. And so there's actually a few zones in this. The first one is a zone where there's no deficit, no plant stress, which is so just below the perm wilting point. Then there's a zone that's where the plant gets into deficit, water deficit, and you have to start thinking, hey, I have to put something on my calendar for next week to put water on for 3 days, depending what kind of soil you have. And then you get into the next zone, which is you're in severe stress, and then you really have to act really quickly to not get into trouble with your plants. So it's this really helps my students to visualize risk in agriculture, right? So if you say, well, there's a great strategy. Whenever you need to add water, add to field capacity, because then that's the maximum you can apply without losing any water. If you go above, then you get percolation. And then they say, well, when do we apply? And you said, well, you can apply before the permanent wilting point. All the hands go up and say, oh, but that's a little too close for comfort, right? Because there's now risk that your cat dies tomorrow and you can't irrigate, and you're already close to and you're not going to go out there and there goes your crop, right? So this risk assessment, how close do you want to go to the permanent wilting point? What is comfortable for you? What kind of risk do you want to take? Are you going to lose 10% of the crop or 20% of the crop, or you go out there and you kind of ahead of the schedule and you say at 50% or 50% of the way to the permanent wilting point I start irrigating. That way you can be assured that you're not going to have not going to lose your crop because you didn't irrigate. So that is. So you look at these two things; they are really cool to play with. And then I have some results from the resin capsules, and they're kind of interesting as well. So these are results from 2021, and these are real data. So these are not like in Joseph's head or in Joseph's computer. These are actually they're in my computer, but they're not modeling results. I take one of those. So I know what I'm talking about. Thank you. Okay, what you see there are a bunch of colorful bars. The department sprung some money for me and said you can do a color copy. That's really cool. Anyway, each color corresponds to different farms, and each farm had resin caps in there for part of the spring, part of the summer, and part of the fall. And so ordinarily we think about any kind of crop as you grow the crop. During the period of time when the crop is growing, nutrients are being picked up, really actively picked up. So nitrogen should be really spare or should be pretty rare in the soil. Should be really low concentrations because the plants are picking it up. And then in the fall, when you finish the season and you take the plant out, then you still have roots in the ground, and those are starting to decompose, and you should get more nitrogen and other nutrients being mineralized and adding to the nutrient content of the soil. So in some cases we actually see this, right? So in spring, so let's look at the blue graph. In spring, the resin caps show you a relatively high amount of total inorganic nitrogen, so nitrate and ammonium. In the summer, that number goes down, and in the fall, it really spikes up. So, in this case, most likely the plants are decomposing, or you may have residual compost that is breaking down, or you added just a lot of fertilizer just before you filled the plants. Unlikely, right? Hopefully. So there are reasons why this may be so high, and some of that in field agriculture we see this a lot. So corn, soybeans, you'll see a lot of these really high spikes in the fall after harvest. But then, there's a couple of other places. So the black and the green, farm have the same pattern. But then the two farms in the middle, the orange and red, have a different pattern. So they have a pattern where in the spring it's low, and then suddenly in the summer it's really high, and then in the fall it's low again. So why is that? So first of all, there could be estimation errors, right? So for example, I took the raw data and I figured out what total inorganic nitrogen is that the resin capsules grabbed out of the soil over the 90-day period. But I didn't really look at how many days these resin capsules were in the ground. So that might have varied between 70 and 90 days. So there is a little bit of error right there that this is the total, not the total per day. So that would be one. Other reasons for these summer spikes? Well, what I said already. They're over application of nitrogen during the growing season. And so if that is really the case, then you combine that with over irrigating, then you're losing some of that nitrogen that you paid good money for. And so as we go into these troublesome days, fertilizers will become more expensive. So we have to be more efficient with them. My garden, I've started to be more careful with it. Partially with disastrous results. But my wife is a horticulturist, and she says, well, that may not be the fertilizer, it may just be something else, like a bug or something. Anyway, there's a lot of things to think about when you do agriculture, and I'm sure that you all have headaches from doing that already. And so I've just added to your headaches. I hope that is okay. Any questions?
Can I assume that all of these greenhouse studies were done, irrigation was underneath plastic?
Yes.
And how do you get it just right? You didn't talk about actually testing the soil.
There's the probes in there that measure soil moisture. And so what we do is we run the model, we compare the results from the model with the results from the actual soil test, the probes that measure soil moisture. And that will then we adjust some of the parameters. For example, I might adjust the point at which the crop starts to slow down with transpiration when the moisture reaches a certain level. So I change that moisture level a little bit, and that changes the output. And then maybe other things, I might change the field capacity number or the converting point to get a better match between reality and the model.
And you're also measuring the humidity in the high tunnel? The air humidity?
We are not. So the reason why we're not doing that is because I talked to a couple of modelers in some high tunnel researchers in Canada, and they're building a model that will take into account the humidity and the airflow in the high tunnel. But they said there's just no way that they can have good results with the model yet. They're still tinkering with it. So what I did, I took weather data, so temperature data. I calculated out a measure of potential evapotranspiration based on the temperature data. So it doesn't take into account humidity at all. And then I adjusted that according to a few studies that have said, well, if the outside has, at this temperature, has this potential evapotranspiration, then you can apply a certain factor to increase or decrease the transpiration in the high temperature.
One other thing that mystifies me is the enormous amount of water comes off the high tunnel from the edges.
Sure.
Are the plants that are close to the edge, they have a very different irrigation problem than out through the middle?
Probably. I mean, the other thing about the edges, the edges also get more airflow, or that they're exposed to higher temperatures or lower temperatures depending what ambient temperature is. Right, so that means that they're different. So we're in the middle of the high tunnel. That's a really good point, and that's partly what these Canadian researchers are struggling with. You know, what is the temperature distribution in the high tunnel, given the distribution of plants, given the different ways that people provide airflow. You know, some people have active airflow and other people have passive airflow. So I wanted their model to inform me for this project, and they said, well, we can't do it yet. We're not confident that it works.
Usually you may get to put up your $1 million, maybe the cannabis guys.
That's true. It's really weird. They throw a lot of stuff into the high tunnels and their greenhouses. But they can do it, right? They don't have the same profit margin that you have. Yeah, so I don't know what to say about that. Really great questions, thank you.
On this first graph, so when the moisture is at fill capacity, no transpiration. That's true for a certain group of crops, I would assume. Not everything.
Not everything, no.
So how do I know which crop group would follow this graph or which ones?
Oh, for me it's easy because I don't have to know, right? So
Yeah.
most models now have databases for different crops. So the model that irrigation model that Cornell put out, that climate smart farming model, is actually has a database of crops, and if you have worked with the NRCS on some kind of erosion control, you probably had to work with them on something called Russell 2, so the revised universal solace equation, and they have an enormous database of crops and management practices for different regions in the country. So you know they have any of the federal regions has its own database for management practices and crops. Because people grow different things, people have different management practices. So amazing databases are already out there to support modeling. So that is what. Is that what you wanted to know?
Yeah.
So Hydrus has a database that even has tomatoes in there, believe it or not.
But it is also generally true that if your soil is saturated, you don't have very much air, and your roots aren't going to be very happy.
No.
And
So
if that-
saturation and fill capacity is different though.
Right.
Yeah.
Saturation is the sponge is
Full.
of water, it's dripping.
Yeah.
Field capacity is it's stopped dripping, but you haven't squeezed it out yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, field capacity. I mean, so it's not necessarily. This is not necessarily the way the soil works, right? But it's a great visualization. Field capacity is when all gravitational drainage stops, right? So the earth is not pulling out water out of that soil anymore. My students always hear that once that happens, once you're done with like gravitational drainage and you're at field capacity, I say, well, then anti-gravity takes effect, right? Then the Star Trek and anti-gravity and those pores are just pulling that water, holding onto that water against gravity. So there's no anti-gravity. But I'm just saying. And then they say, what is static? And then I have to get into that. And that's the whole lecture.
Yes.
And ideally on these graphs, so the summer should be a little higher and the fall should go down if you don't want to lose nutrient. Is that how it is?
No, it's
Ideally?
more, I mean, in the summertime, you shouldn't receive very many nutrients in the soil because the plants are picking up the nutrients, right?
Okay.
And then when you harvest the plant or you terminate the tomato plant, you can probably still harvest in there right now. But if you once you terminate, once you clean out the high tunnel, then there's still roots in the ground, and they start to decompose and then nutrients are mineralized, and then you would be able to pick up those nutrients in the soil test. So in the fall you should see more nutrients in the soil.
Yeah. Without knowing which farm is which, one thing I'm wondering is whether those two, orange and red, are ones that were growing winter greens right after the tomatoes.
It could be, yeah.
Because we did definitely have some.
I can tell you who they are.
Yep,
I
later
sent you
it's
an
fine,
email.
yeah.
I anonymized them because I didn't really want didn't want you to know who they are.
But that would take up
Sure.
many of the nutrients.
And that it could also be that there's a ton of weeds growing. So weeds are also
Yeah.
things that pick up nutrients. Weeds are important. I worked on a project where we looked at fallow syndrome, which basically you had kept the soil fallow. You didn't have any plants in it, not even weeds, and then 2 years later you're planting something and the growth is stunted so one of the hypotheses is that happens because there's the mycorrhizal populations or communities are not.
So we have a short talk here between us and pizza. So this is just for fun. Colorful. What do you want? Plastic molds that blocks weeds, worms, soil, and holds in moisture. And what do you not want is to have to pull the plastic out of the field and haul it to the dump or pile it up in the muddy heap somewhere. And what do you want? So biodegradable plastic molds that actually breaks in the field. And when can we have it? Now we can have it. Like Steve has been using it for many years now. This is a part of our CPPM crop protection grant from USDA NIFA, where we are just trialing a row of biodegradable plastic molds on tomatoes. Steve has been using it in many other crops, but this is the first year is trying it on tomatoes. The main concern is sticking it on the fruit. We'll hear from Steve of his experience using plastic molds for a number of years now. One of the main questions that comes in is it actually gonna degrade? Is plastic going to degrade? There are two answers to that question, no and yes, depending on the plastic material. No, for obviously regular traditional plastic, it takes 300 years to start degrading. It's gonna degrade eventually, but it's gonna take 300 years to degrade, eventually go away. Oxo-degradable, that came in the marketplace in 1990s and created all the fears among the growers because they were supposed to be degradable as they were marketed, but they were not actually completely biodegradable. They were fragmentable because non-degradable plastic polymers were binded together with degradable additives. So what happened is they just fragmented. became smaller and smaller, but they never went away. And the third category, biodegradable, which can be categorized into two different kinds. Soil biodegradable, those are the really degradable, and compostable. And compostable are also marketed as biodegradable in general, but they are gonna take a little bit more years to degrade because they need higher temperature to degrade. But the soil biodegradable that has those have passed the standards. There are multiple standards to test the soil biodegradability of plastic, such as 17033, which is the European standard, now also adopted in US. If they pass those tests, they are actually gonna biodegrade in soil, and that's what we have been experiencing in different farms and with growers in Connecticut. And second thing on this handout is, do the yields with biodegradable mulch compared to the yields with regular polyethylene mulch. This table is summary of various crops that were tested with bare ground, polyethylene mulch, and biodegradable mulch. You see lots of pluses, lots of equals, and a few minuses and equivalent. That pluses means biodegradable plastic mulch work better, equal means equivalent, and minus means worked poor than the whatever is on the top of the column. So you see most equals and pluses, that means biodegradable mulch actually work comparable to polyethylene mulch and better than bare ground for most of these crops that were tested. This is summary of all the crops that were tested until 2017. Can it be applied in the field just like PE mulch? Pretty much, but it needs to be laid little loose because it tightens itself after it's laid. On the next page, there is a graph that shows the degradation of the plastic mulch in the field. This is a 5 years or 6 year experiment where we started using the plastic mulch in spring of 2015. Black arrow is application of the mulch. The dotted arrow is the incorporation of the mulch in the field. So you see that we started applying it in 2015 annually until 2018, and then tilled it in every year in the same location, same exact spot. And you see the mulch recovery from the field is going down even after repeated application. You don't see it 100% 1 year, 200%, 300%, 400%. It's going down from like 75% down to 10-15% after 2 years after the final application. So four layers of mulch were applied, but you're getting only 15%, 10%, 15% at the end. So that means it is actually going away. These were done in a replicated treatment, control treatment. So we made sure that the mulch pieces were not moving and disappearing by other means. So these actually work and they do go away. So with that, I will let Steve share his experience and how he is finding it.
This is our first time using this one, Bio 360.
This is a Bio 360.
Yeah, and this one supposedly does not have tomatoes. The tomatoes will not stick to it, or it won't stick to the tomatoes. And we haven't harvested here yet, so I was just checking them out, and it does not seem to be sticking to any of it. The material is already breaking down. There was a lot of weeds in it. We pulled the weeds out.
Yeah, it's not sticking.
Yeah, so but you can see that it's already degrading right through here. But for the most part, some of these tomatoes that are going to sit on bare ground will probably rot, but we'll see when we harvest them. Anyways, this one, so far, it seems to be doing what it says it will do. And that's the first time we've tried it. We do have another variety over here. We've been growing eggplant and squash. What else there?
Really, we're everything is on BioGold except for tomatoes and melons at this point.
Yeah, and
This one seems to hold up the best. Now this year was dry too. You know, it was dry up until recently. You know, I know that might factor in, but it certainly seems to perform as close to a regular plastic compared to any of the other ones we tried.
Yeah, it does now. Suresh, feel this isn't really a biodegradable, soil biodegradable?
I'm more concerned about this particular product, but I do not have evidence to back up either way.
It does hold up well.
It looks too good to be true. With the stress, the feel, I've worked with 10 different types of biodegradable plastic molds. This one appears to be the toughest until the time it needs to go into the soil, but Steve's experience has been positive so far. So we are gonna do a little test next year where we are gonna cut small pieces of different kinds of plastic and put it in a nylon mesh bag and bury it in the ground and come back after 3 months, 6 months, 1 year to see which ones are actually disappearing and which ones are still there.
What we do with this is we pull the water line out and harrow it all, mow it, pull the water line out and harrow it up. We did a piece of, we had transplanted corn out in the back of the farm over there, and you know, we didn't have any drip lining there, we just overhead watered it, and we harrowed it up, and there was a bunch of pieces there. Suresh was there for that. But Eric just harrowed it yesterday, and it seems to have wiped them. Those pieces are gone. So that was about a month later. So it does seem to be going away. This one also comes as a white on black. It's a little more expensive. We have some peppers over there on that, and that one looks very, very similar to this. Very tough looking. It's our first time trying that. We'll see how it did well with the peppers, and we'll see how it goes away. Yeah, it'll be a test to see. It's not that much more expensive. It's you know, 3 or 4 cents a foot, 5 cents a foot for maybe the wider plastic, 5-foot plastic. So it's very, very close to traditional black plastic. So that's a good thing. And there's no labor in pulling it up except getting the drip line out of there. So that is a huge thing, especially in a wet fall when you're trying to get that out of there. You got a lot of weeds like we always seem to have. It binds up and everything. So being able to just harrow it in, that is a great way to finish up the year.
Yeah, that's the main thing for us. Is it's a labor saver. I'd like to see it be more like the regular plastic. And if labor wasn't an issue, it would be all regular plastic. But to go pull a whole farm full of plastic at the end of the year sucks. So this is nice just to let it down and plow it into the ground.
If you look at the whole picture from purchasing to the end of the season, it probably saves little money, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the labor of pulling that all up at the end of the year, the aggravation coming to that. Yeah. We also have grown peppers on film organic, which is reminds me a lot of this Bio 360. It starts, the edges start rotting away and stuff. And, you know, I see that the wind gets blowing and it rips the plastic, and this one is doing that a little bit in spots. That's kind of a nuisance. But you know, we do get a crop out of it. And it does keep the weeds down enough that we're able to harvest the peppers, and they do pretty good.
Yeah.
I don't know, is there other kinds besides Film Organic and Bio Gold and Bio 360 or other ones that you have tried and know?
Yeah, Organics AZ was one, which seemed to be gone out of market or changed the ownership. And we tested a Nature Cycle that came out from Washington State, a small company. Another one was Metabolics, made in Minnesota. So when we say biodegradable, we tend to group them together, but there are many different kinds, and farmers need to make sure to look the labels and make sure that they have gone through the testing, especially the biodegradability testing. Some of these materials claim to be biodegradable, but doesn't present any evidence of going through testing. So farmers as a user need to be careful about that. And these plastics are not allowed in organic systems because right now the rule says they must be 100% bio-based. They are changing the rule to 80%. That will happen in a couple of years, but that still is not going to make a huge change because currently available in market are up to like maximum of 30%, 40%, and in Europe about 50%. And talking to the mulch manufacturers, they say 60% could be practical, but 80% they can make 100% bio-based, but that's bio-based. That means the ingredient is bio-based. That doesn't have anything to do with the biodegradability. We need to educate our people who sit on the NOSB board that biodegradability and bio-based are totally different things. So there appears to be confusion, and that's why they said 100% bio-based, now bringing it down to 80%, but still not going to be practical for them to produce in an affordable price. It's feasible it's practical to produce, but it's gonna cost use and not practical for growers.
What is it made out of if it's not bio-based?
So petroleum.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's petroleum synthetic, that's why not allowed in organic system. That's the main reason they are not allowed in organic system now. There are other reasons, but that's the main one.
Question for you, Suresh, just because my students keep bringing it up, and you know more about these than I do. So when they break down, when the biodegradables break down, do you wind up with microplastics?
Yes, in the transition phase, we don't actually know how long is the transition, but looking at this data, it looks like it's between 2 years and 3 years for most of the products. But in that transient period, they're gonna be fragmented into small pieces, smaller. Anything less than 2-3 mm is microplastic. So they end up being microplastic for a certain period, but and at that point they will be consumed by microbes and they will be gone. So yeah, and real concern is when they are in microplastic phase, do they pose real concern with getting into the food chain, getting into the plants? So far there is no evidence that they're really harmful, but it's been maybe 10-15 years they're being researched, so still in that early phase for that, but so far evidence is so they are safe.
Is there anything special you have to do with the bed layer or field prep before you put it in?
The only thing we found is that we have to loosen the rollers a little where the plastic rolls out. Instead of, with the Boss plastic, you tighten up the rollers so they put a little bit of resistance on the rolling, and that makes that embossed plastic just stretches right over the bed and it's tight. But you just turn back on those adjustments and let the wheels roll a little bit. So it's going down a little bit, less tight, and it works. It works fine. It's just that fine adjustment on the machine. It's the only thing we do different, and it seems to work.
And you're welcome to feel this row of plastic. It feels a little different than regular plastic. Any other questions? Hopefully our pizza is ready.
Yeah, it should be up there right away pretty soon.
So I heard correctly that you haven't had luck with it on melons either, right?
Well, we haven't really tried it, but
Okay.